Good afternoon. Welcome to the Tyler Mahoning Valley History Center. On behalf of all the members, board of directors, staff, volunteers of the Mahoning Valley Historical Society. For those of you who don't know, my name is Bill Lawson. I'm executive director of the Historical Society, and as always, we're very pleased to have this large and enthusiastic crowd here for our Bites and Bits of History program, sponsored by the John and Loretta Hines Foundation. We have a great program today, but before we get into that, I just want to mention we opened a new exhibit at the Arms Family Museum at the beginning of this month. It's called the Enchanted Evening Formal Wear from the Jean D. Tyler Collection. And that's in our costume gallery up there, and it represents 3 generations of formal wear from Mrs. Tyler and her family. And so really some spectacular pieces to see there. And the Arms Family Museum and Tyler History Center are both open Tuesday through Sunday from noon to 4. And we have a single admission price if you want to visit both sites on that day. Your single admission price covers both sites. Of course, if you're a member of the Mahoning Valley Historical Society, you can go for free anytime you want. I just have to put that out there. As always, if you're interested in membership, please check in the back. Linda Koska's back at the refreshment table, and she'd be happy to talk to you about that. We have some information on the table, including the Bites and Bits card, which if you have one of those and get stamped, you get a nice little incentive once you've come to 5 of our Bites and Bits programs. I'll mention now, in case I forget to do it later, but our next Bites and Bits program is Thursday, April 18, once again in this room, and the topic is Youngstown and the Titanic. We like to talk about that in April because it's a disaster that continues over generations to fascinate people. But we'll talk about our own community's connection to that disaster in 1912, and our curator of education, Tracy Manning, who's in the back, will be doing that program for us. So please come back on Thursday, April 18th. But today, we're going to go to the north of Mahoning County into Trumbull County. And we're very pleased to have the director of the Trumbull County Historical Society, which is our counter organization that we are working with and having a very positive relationship, that's based in Warren at the John Stark Edwards House, and also they have a new facility which they'll be developing in the coming years, but I'm not going to talk about that. But today, Meghan Reed, the director of the Trumbull County Historical Society, will talk about the John Stark Edwards family, who were the people that occupied the house. Meghan holds a master's degree in public history from the University of North Carolina in Greensboro. She started at Trumbull County Historical Society in 2015, and over the last 4 years has grown the operating budget, membership, increased attendance, which is all part of Warren's oldest home, the John Stark Edwards home that is now a public museum. Outside of her work, Meghan currently serves as the president of the W.D. Packard Foundation, which is dedicated to preserving the Packard legacy through improvement projects at Packard Park and the Packard Music Hall, as well as on the executive committee and governing council of Any Given Child Initiative, a program through the Kennedy Center that ensures art education for all pre-K to 3 students, pre-K to 8 students, just those bifocals there, in the Warren City schools. But something happened more recently. Earlier this year, Mahoning Valley Young Professionals 25 under 35 class of 2019, Meghan was one of the MVP award winners for 25 under 35 this year. So it's a great pleasure to, yes. It is a great pleasure to have Meghan here to talk about the John Stark Edwards family.
Hello, everybody. How are you doing today? Thank you, Bill, for that wonderful introduction. I'm absolutely thrilled to be here with you guys today presenting on this topic. The Mahoning Valley Historical Society is an organization that I've looked up to for many years now, and it's an absolute pleasure to be here talking about something that I'm incredibly passionate about, the John Stark Edwards house and the John Stark Edwards family. And before we begin, I would just want to say a couple of words about the presentation. First and foremost, we are going to be talking about the John Stark Edwards house during the years that you see on the screen here, from when it was built in 1807 to when the Trumbull County Historical Society took over in 1938. And I say that because I absolutely love this quote from the Place Governance Working Group. They're a committee out of Detroit who specializes in placemaking initiatives, and their report found it's placemaking, not place-made. It's a process. You are never finished. So we'll be talking about the John Stark Edwards house within those specific years, but that's not to say that there were significant and powerful stories at the house that came after and still continue to happen, but we're looking within those specific years within a couple of families. So we'll start the presentation by talking about the John Stark Edwards house and the structure and what it is, and then we'll move into the John Stark Edwards family, spend most of our time there, and then I do want to touch on a couple of other families that lived in the home before we wrap up today. So does that sound good to everybody? Cool. All right. So this photograph of the John Stark Edwards house was taken in 1936 as part of the HAB survey. Are any of you familiar with the HAB survey that was done in the 1930s? A few? Cool. All right, so for those of you who aren't, during the Works Progress Administration, there were teams that went across the country and did surveys of historic buildings as part of that project. So we are very fortunate that the John Stark Edwards house was a part of that process, and they took exterior photographs of the historic buildings they were surveying, nothing interior, from at least at the John Stark Edwards house. And then they also did architectural drawings of the building and some of the components inside. And I know this is a bit small on the screen here, but you can see in the upper left-hand corner, we have some of the architectural drawings that they did. On the bottom here are a couple of fireplaces. In our case, they're mostly coming out of the New England Federal Adams style from when John Stark Edwards built the house. And then on the right-hand side in that upper corner is the downstairs layout, a blueprint of the home as it was in 1936. They also did an upstairs layout as well. And we'll be looking at the HABS drawings a bit later as well, just to familiarize you guys with that process. The other thing to mention about the John Stark Edwards house before we delve into the family is that it was moved, and it's actually been moved twice. Have any of you taken a tour of the house, have been to the Edwards house before? Wonderful, awesome. So you probably know this already. The house was moved once in the 1960s and then again to its current location in 1986. The pictures that you see on the screen here are of when the house was moved in 86. It used to sit right where the Tribune Chronicle's headquarters are, if you're familiar with that area in downtown Warren, on South Street or Youngstown Road. And then we moved to our current location on Monroe Street, across from Warren City Hall and the library in 1986. So when we talk about the house and the people that lived there, they would not have been living in the house at its site as you visit today. It would have been on South Street at the time. So to jump into John Stark Edwards and Louisa, we're going to start with his wife, Louisa. First of all, because it's Women's History Month, so that's kind of cool. But also because her story is my absolute favorite in this presentation. She's one of my absolute favorite people. But before we dive into her story, I do always like to make the disclaimer that this picture that you see here of her up on the screen is the only one that survives of her. It's of her later in life. And I don't necessarily think that this image of her does her credit, because we'll be talking about her when she was in her 20s, and from all accounts, she was an absolutely beautiful woman earlier in her years. So with that being said, I always like to show these two pictures as well. They are not of Louisa, but they are of women in New England where she grew up during the same time period and in the same social class as she would have been. So you get an idea of the style that she would have been wearing, what she could have possibly looked like during the time period when we will primarily be discussing her. The woman on the left is unmarried. The woman, and in her late teens, the woman on the right is married. You can see her shoulders are more covered up. She's wearing her cap there and is in her mid-20s. So two images to look back on as we talk about her in this story. And Louisa was born in Springfield, Vermont. The house on the right still stands. This is her childhood home. It's privately owned, but you can drive by it. And the man that you see here on the left is her father, Lewis Morris. And we're going to pause here for a second in her story and go back quite a bit farther from then. She was born in 1787. And talk about some early Dutch history, which I know seems a little off topic, but if you could roll with me here, I promise I'll make the connection. So early on in the state of New York's history, there's an area there called the Hudson River Valley. Is anybody familiar? Have you visited the Hudson River Valley? Wonderful. It's my absolute favorite place in the world. I go every year just for my mental health. It's absolutely beautiful. Lots of history from the early Dutch settlers all the way up to the Hudson River Valley painters. Highly recommend it. But Louisa's story really begins with the history of the Dutch settlement there because that significantly influenced her family. In the 1600s, the Dutch, through the Dutch West India Company, started settling in New York State and growing these massive amounts of land holdings. Beyond what we could possibly think of today. This map shows the Hudson River. You can see the Hudson River going straight through there. And all of the pink that you see on this map, this huge area of land here, and this area down here in pink, were all owned by the Van Rensselaer family. And they were the largest land-owning Dutch family in New York at the time. And the way that their family was structured was the family was headed by someone they called the dragoon. And that particular person within the Van Rensselaer family at the time was Kilian Van Rensselaer. He owned over 4 million acres in New York. So you can imagine if you wanted to marry into a family and you were Dutch at the time, these are the guys you wanted to connect with, right? And Kilian Van Rensselaer started this family legacy that will trickle down to his great-grandchildren and great-great-grandchildren to when we get to Johan Van Rensselaer, a direct descendant of the original Kilian Van Rensselaer. And Johan Van Rensselaer marries into another very wealthy Dutch family in New York called the Schuyler family. So, has anybody seen or heard the music from the musical Hamilton? Yes? Awesome. So you will hear the Schuyler sisters. They were from that family. Their father was Philip Schuyler. And Philip Schuyler married Catherine Van Rensselaer. And this was not the first time that the Van Rensselaer family and the Schuyler family had married in together. Their families were very prominent. They were incredibly wealthy, and they owned pretty much the more than the majority of the land in the Hudson River Valley. So again, when we think of Hamilton and Alexander Hamilton as a person being the right-hand man of George Washington, Louisa's father, Lewis Morris, was also a general during the Revolutionary War, and he needed Philip Schuyler, I need to back up for a second, I got my head turned around. Philip Schuyler was a general during the American Revolution, and he needed a right-hand man, just like George Washington did, and he picked Lewis Morris for that position. And because of Lewis Morris's position and his service to Philip Schuyler during the Revolutionary War, Lewis Morris became an incredibly wealthy man and owned a ton of land up in New York. So you can imagine the kind of family that Louisa was brought up in, right? In Vermont, very wealthy family. She attended all of the best schools. And we're going to leave her there at about 18, 20 years of age as the daughter of Lewis Morris and from a very wealthy high society family. So we're going to pause there for a second with her and talk about who would become her husband, John Stark Edwards. And we only have one picture of his wife, Louisa. I'm very sorry to say that absolutely zero likenesses of John Stark Edwards survive to this day. We have none. But we do have the likenesses of his father and his grandfather. Does anybody know who the man on the right is? No? Yeah, Cindy, go ahead. Yeah. Yes, so John Stark Edwards' grandfather is the man that you see on the right here in his 1700s garb. He was a fire and brimstone preacher coming out of Connecticut who really started the first Great Awakening. He wrote Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, that sermon, and really pushed the idea of the fire and brimstone preacher at the time. He had many children, one of which was Pierpont Edwards here. He might be my favorite person. I find him incredibly dashing. And Pierpont Edwards also had many sons and daughters as well. They had a ton of children. But Pierpont Edwards came from this very wealthy, very entrenched family up in New England. His father, Jonathan Edwards, when he died, he was president of Princeton College, which of course at the time was the College of New Jersey, and Pierpont married Frances Ogden, whose cousin was in a law practice with Alexander Hamilton, also very well-known family at the time. And John Stark Edwards' story and how he gets down here to Ohio really starts with his father, because his father was a member of the Connecticut Land Company. And I know I'm talking to a crowd with the Mahoning Valley Historical Society today, so how many of you really have a good grasp on the Connecticut Western Reserve? Awesome. Awesome. So I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time going over the history of that, but just to give a brief overview for those of you who are a little bit more of a beginner with that topic, in 1662, King Charles II of England started granting land claims to colonies across the seas. New York had a land claim, Massachusetts had a land claim, Pennsylvania did, and Connecticut's particular land claim said that it owned the land the length of itself all the way to the sea. And of course, this is way before Lewis and Clark. They had absolutely no idea where the sea was, but it was to encourage settlement at the time, and also to make sure that other people who were looking for land to claim land, like France and Portugal, that they couldn't claim that land. Of course they did anyways, and it ended up being kind of a legal mess, but that's kind of a side note to our topic. The state of Connecticut owned the length of land itself to the sea for all intents and purposes. Now when we think of Connecticut, we think of it kind of being up north, right? It's in New England, it's up in the northern states, but when you look on a map, we're right across from Connecticut here. So you can see this black outlined area here is the state of Connecticut. The red lines that you see here are that land claim going all the way to the sea. And then this pink area in this area of Northeast Ohio is the Connecticut Western Reserve, as it would be called. So after the American Revolution, a lot of states were in debt from the war, and the newly formed federal government went to those individual states and said, if you give up your land claim, we will let your debt go. And newly formed state governments, this was a very appealing proposition, right? So a lot of them gave up their land claim. That was absorbed into the federal government, and we continued on with how the United States was developed. But Connecticut was incredibly stubborn. Lots of very heated battles up there at the time, whether they should give up their land claim or not. And what ended up happening is they gave up their claim to the sea, but we kept this size of land, this pink area here, the same size as the state of Connecticut. The state of Connecticut's 120 miles long. The Western Reserve is 120 miles long, west of the Pennsylvania border. So that land was owned by the state of Connecticut. Most people at the time called it New Connecticut. And it was settled by 57 very wealthy investors coming out of Hartford, Connecticut, who bought into the Connecticut Land Company to settle that land. So you can imagine before that time, there weren't that many people living in this area, mostly hunting grounds for Native American tribes. Some trading posts were here, but no real settlements like Youngstown, one of the first ones, had developed yet. So this is one of the very first maps, and I'll just kind of show this briefly. This is the Heckwelder map from 1890, it's either 1894 or 1896. And the loop in the bend here is where Warren would develop. But the survey of all of this land down here was done in 1796 by a man that I'm sure you've all heard of before, Moses Cleveland, and his team. Seth Peace was part of that team. And they ended up coming down here. This particular map shows Trumbull County. It was the same for Mahoning County, the way that it was structured. And they parceled out the lots that the 57 men from Connecticut were buying into. So Pierpont Edwards, John Stark Edwards' father, purchased 2 of these lots. And when we scroll in, we can see on that map, they actually write who purchased that land. And we can see Edwards' name right here. This particular one was in Mesopotamia, the township of Mesopotamia, a bit north. And Pierpont Edwards had many children. John Stark Edwards was not his firstborn son. And Pierpont Edwards essentially went to John Stark Edwards and said, I'm going to give you my land in the Connecticut Land Company. I'm going to give you 2 chairs and some family china. Go forth. Make what you can, right? So this was his inheritance. And at 22 years old in 1799, John Stark Edwards arrives in Warren, well, in Mesopotamia at first, from Connecticut, making that 6-week trek down here to build his own livelihood and start his own life. This is a document that Pierpont Edwards signed along with the members of the Connecticut Land Company. This particular document is in the archives of the Bernanke Library at Yale University that shows that he owned the land, that he signed over and purchased the land down here. And then this is the Connecticut Western Reserve. I'm sure many of you have seen this map before. It's a popular one that floats around, the 1826 map. All right, so once John Stark Edwards gets down here, he has incredibly high hopes for what his house is going to become. And I absolutely love this quote from him. In 1802, this is before he was married, I can behold cities rising which shall equal in populousness and splendor those of the Atlantic states. A rich, well-improved, and highly cultivated country with as great a share of the luxuries and equipment as are necessary for our happiness. We have trebled the numbers within the past 2 years, and at no time since I have been acquainted with the country have the immigrations been so great as they have this present season. And I love this quote because it really shows his optimism. You can see that he thought Warren was going to be essentially what Chicago would become, the gateway to the West, right? When we look at Baltimore and Boston and the cities that he would have been modeling this after, this is really what he was looking for when he was growing Warren as a city. All of that to say that this was before he was married. He was living in Mesopotamia at the time. John Stark Edwards became the first recorder of Trumbull County. He was very civically involved in terms of investing with the first Trumbull County courthouse and also on a committee that was building bridges around the area. And he kept getting letters from his siblings back in New England pushing him to get married. And he keeps writing back saying, no, I'm good, stop it. And one of these letters, in 1805, John Stark Edwards writes his brother, he apparently changed his mind by then, I am heartily tired of living alone and am determined to marry as soon as I can find a woman to have me that will answer. You can imagine the kind of family John Stark Edwards is coming from. For better or for worse, he had incredibly high expectations of the woman he was going to marry. He had no intentions of marrying somebody from New Connecticut or Ohio, and he was looking back in New England for a possible bride. His brother Ogden writes back, your ideas of women are such as would lead you to wish for a wife who would not only amuse and please you, but who would make a dignified and highly enchanting companion. And that's how he spelled please too, that's not a typo. And then a little bit before that, in 1803, his sister Henrietta, who ended up marrying Eli Whitney, the inventor of the cotton gin, writes to him, and she had been writing for many years trying to convince him to marry this one woman or another. There were many that she had suggested. But in 1803, she writes, "I've met but one who will answer for your wife, and she's the very thing, in many respects, answering your purpose, far better than Betsy." I don't know who Betsy is, but apparently she just wasn't good enough. "It is Louisa Morris. Yours is the very situation that would please her, for she is fond of retirement, though never dull or gloomy in disposition, but far the reverse. She was only 16 last April. By the time you are ready to marry, she will be of the right age. Don't say it is all nonsense, for I'm earnest about it. Oh, she's divine. You will come to New Haven, you shall see her. Guard well your heart till then." So it took him a couple years, but in 1806, he does make the return trip home to New England. He goes to Springfield, Vermont, in that yellow house we saw earlier in the presentation to meet her. We don't know how that conversation went, but we do know by 1807 they were married, and John Stark Edwards brought her back down to Warren to live. And this map shows one of the possible routes they would have taken at the time. I actually believe downstairs in the exhibit at the Tyler Center, there's some information on their cousin, Margaret Dwight, who made a similar trek in 1810. And you can see the different stops along the way and what that could have been like. There were many inns, there were many taverns along the way from Connecticut to the Western Reserve. The accommodations were lacking. More than lacking, you can say, in terms of whether you got a bed or you didn't get a bed and how many people were really traveling on that road at the time. But you can imagine, based on Louisa's experience growing up, what this kind of experience and this kind of travel would have meant for her. Landing in Warren here in 1807 with no home. They stayed in the family of Simon Perkins for a year until John Stark Edwards had finished building the house that he would build for them. Just to give you an idea of population and what that would have looked like at the time here as well. Now we're going to go back for a second to the Habs drawings that we mentioned earlier in the presentation. When we say that John Stark Edwards built the John Stark Edwards house in 1807, it's a little misleading. So we're going to take this map from 1936, and we're going to break that down a bit. So when John Stark Edwards first built his home in 1807, he built the first framed building in Warren. It's the oldest remaining home that exists today, and it was the first house in Warren that was not a log cabin. With that being said, it was still very tiny. It was not what you see today. So this area outlined in yellow here is the original structure that he built. It was just a 3-room home at the time. Big fireplace and open area, kind of a multi-purpose room. In the middle here, this area you see dining room and kitchen. There's a big fireplace along this side of the wall. This room on the side right here would have been their bedroom, a very small bedroom for him, his wife, and what would become 3 sons. And then this room on the other side would have been their parlor where they could have received guests. So at the time, this is the 3-room house that they would have been living in. 2 years later, in 1809, John Stark Edwards has 2 sons, and he knows they have to expand this house. It's just not enough room for the 4 of them. So he ends up adding on these 2 front parlors here. One would have been a more informal working parlor. One would have been their best parlor, somewhere they could have entertained guests. And when John Stark Edwards passes away in 1813, this is how the house stood. So when he passes away, we have essentially this first half of the building here as the house that they were living in. The kitchen and storage areas that you see on the back of this drawing were added on later. So 1809, the 2 additions were put on. John Stark Edwards in 1813 passes away of what we think was some kind of pneumonia. Of course, the War of 1812 is going on at the time. Edwards owned some property up near Sandusky, Ohio, and he takes a trip up there with a couple of his friends to check on his property to make sure that his livestock and his land is okay during the war. And on his return trip home, he catches what we think was some kind of pneumonia and passes away before he's able to make it home to Warren. So just within about a year, a little less than a year, his widow, Louisa, remarries, and she actually moves to Youngstown. Her second husband was Robert Montgomery. They lived for Youngstown for a while. They also lived in Poland. And she sold the property very quickly after that to a man named Thomas Denny Webb. Kind of time check before I keep going. Can someone tell me what time it is? 12:31. Cool. Thank you. Doing okay. So in 1814, Thomas Denny Webb ends up purchasing the John Stark Edwards house. Him, his wife, and their 3 daughters move into the home. Like most people in the Western Reserve at the time, Thomas Denny Webb was from Connecticut. He had moved down to Warren the same year that Edwards built his house in 1807, and he was a newspaper man. And he started the very first newspaper in the Western Reserve called the Trump of Fame. It was published in 1812. And my favorite story about the Trump of Fame is that its original name was supposed to be the Voice of the Wilderness. You can imagine what they thought of this area down here at the time. And but on the trip from Connecticut to Warren, they had lost the type, the letters, for the V and the W. And they couldn't write that name out. So until they had the time to remake those letters, he was anxious to get the paper started. So they just changed the name to the Trump of Fame. We actually call our newsletter today the Trump of Fame in honor of the newspaper he started in 1812. They were the very first newspaper to report on the Battle of Lake Erie with Commodore Perry, and would have existed for many years. Eventually, it was an ancestor of the current Tribune Chronicle, which is, of course, Warren's newspaper today. So Thomas Denny Webb, his wife Betsy, and their 3 daughters lived in the Edwards house until the 1870s. This is just kind of small copy of the 1860 census. 2 of their daughters had moved out, well, one of their daughters had moved out by then. Their oldest daughter, Laura, married a man named Dr. Warren Iddings, and we'll talk about him in a minute, and had moved away. She lived in Pennsylvania for a few years before she moved back here. Their youngest daughter, Elizabeth Webb, passed away very young when she was just 10 years old. And their middle daughter, Adeline, we know very little about Adeline. There are no records really about her, except that a census report states that she was still living at home and she was being cared for by her mother. It's very possible that she had some kind of either intellectual disability that made her stay at home. She was never married, she never had children, and you can see in the 1860 census that she's 42, and she's still living at home then. Betsy, Thomas Denny Webb's wife, lives to the miraculous age of 103 years old. She actually outlives all of her children and her husband. And Thomas Denny Webb, you can see he's 75 there in that year, in 1860. And he passed away during the Civil War, but of natural causes at home. And after he passed away, he ended up passing on the house to his daughter and her husband, their first daughter, Laura, and her husband, Dr. Warren Iddings. Again, not the best picture of him, but this is the only one that we have. And Laura would have grown up in the John Stark Edwards house, and we know that she was very accomplished. She was very well educated. She went away for a bit to train in Europe as an artist. We have one of her paintings that remains in our collection, and this is a charcoal drawing of the Kingston Bridge, which is right outside of London. And actually, this is the china that Laura and Dr. Iddings were given on their wedding. And she marries a man named Dr. Warren Iddings, who's from Warren, and has an incredibly fascinating story. We don't know that much about him in terms of his personal life or even where his office was, but he's a medical doctor. And he's a medical doctor practicing during the Civil War. And what's particularly fascinating about Dr. Warren Iddings, I'll actually put him back on the screen while we're talking about him, is that he was one of the very first people in the country that was given license during the war to practice with embalming techniques. So when we're looking at the Civil War, it's the first time in US history when science had advanced enough to really do embalming on a larger scale, but nobody really knew how to do it very well, right? So Dr. Warren Iddings was tasked, he was given permission by the federal government to go into battlefields and practice with embalming bodies for how to bring them home. And you can see a couple of examples from that time period of what this could have possibly looked like. This is one tent set up in a Civil War battlefield of embalming. And this next picture might be my favorite. The caption on this picture states that the two men that you see in the coffins, they were just actors portraying people for this particular picture. But this particular firm was very well known, Cameron and Lyford's, for embalming on battlefields as well. And then we have one more picture for Dr. Warren Iddings here. So Dr. Warren Iddings and Laura lived in that house, and their descendants lived in the John Stark Edwards house. They had many children until 1936, at which point their son, William T. Iddings, passed away. And at that point, the house sat vacant or rented for 2 years, and then in 1938, it was transferred to the Trumbull County Historical Society, and we operate that house today. So to do a shameless plug before I wrap up and take some questions, we are open to the public every Thursday through Saturday from 1 to 4 p.m., April through December, so we'll start our open hours in April. And in addition to that, we hold a collection of about 20,000 items that we preserve and open to the public in an archive, and do a series of programs. So if any of you do live in Trumbull County and have a house that's over 75 years old, we operate a historic building plaque program for those homes, as well as do education programs and a series of walking tours and a lecture series throughout the year. Does anybody have any questions? Yes?
Back a ways, you were talking about
Yeah.
Mesopotamia.
Mm-hmm.
I tried to get there a couple times.
Yep.
With my grandchildren to the oldest general store.
Mm-hmm.
Is that where is that? Is in Mesopotamia?
That is Mesopotamia, yes.
Well, how far would it be from this area or in Warren? I think I went around for 2 hours and I couldn't find it.
From Warren, it's a 30-minute drive. So you can imagine how long it would have taken on horseback.
Yeah.
I'm not sure how long it would take from Youngstown. I've never done that
I think it's
search.
still functioning, isn't it?
The general store is still functioning, yes. Yeah, and they do have a historical society up there, but you need to call them in advance to make an appointment. They have a small museum operating in a barn up there as well. Yes?
They actually expanded that a few years ago. They have, it's a pretty interesting place. It's worth a day trip anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. And within a very easy walking distance of their square, a bunch of their local historical society has done a plaque program for almost every single historic building up there. So if you walk around, you can look on the buildings and it'll say what year they were built. And it's just, it's a really nice day trip.
My grandson, he was like 10 or 12, well, he's now 25 years old. And I was disappointed because they both, and my granddaughter, they both had an interest in going, but I just couldn't get there.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yes?
It says 39 miles or 52 minutes from Youngstown, Massachusetts.
Wonderful, thank you. Yes?
Do you have any record of whether an architect or builder was involved with the historic house?
No, we do not. It's very possible that early there wasn't. In 1807, they were still using more of a barter system in Warren than an actual, they did have currency, but mostly it was more of a barter system where the people that were there were helping each other build up this community. If there was an architect that John Stark Edwards had contracted to work, we have no record of that. Yeah, Janet?
Why did he move from Mesco down to Warren?
Yeah, that's a good question. So his father purchased the land and the shares of land in Mesopotamia. When John Stark Edwards first arrived there, he built the first grist mill in Mesopotamia, the first cabin, really set up their town square, was very involved in that area when he first got here. But Warren was the economic hub at the time. Many of you know it was the capital of of Trumbull County in the Western Reserve then. He was one of the very first lawyers that came down here from Connecticut, and he became the first recorder of Trumbull County. So he was taking that horseback ride very often. And when he was married in 1807, he made the choice to build his house in Warren and settle there. We do have records of the land agent that his father hired to really manage things along with Edwards. His name was Seth Tracy, and he stayed up in Mesopotamia to take care of their family's holdings there. Yes?
Were you aware of any descendants of any of these people?
Yeah, so John Stark Edwards and his wife Louisa, and I didn't mention this before, and I should have, I apologize. Right after Louisa remarried, in a very tragic slate of events, she lost her husband and 2 of her sons within a year of each other. Only one of her sons survived to adulthood, and we've never been able to trace any descendants from that line that still exists today. The Webb family, and then his daughter, Laura Eddings, that took over the house. There are still remaining descendants of that family in the area. Most of them had moved up to the New York State area, and then one gentleman ended up settling back in Oberlin, Ohio, who had the original furniture that they used in the John Stark Edwards house. He passed away in March of 2017, and we were very fortunate to have that furniture bequeathed back to us. And he did have children that survive and we're in touch with, but nobody directly from the Edwards line.
Can I add to that?
Yeah, please.
About the child, of the descendant. Actually, the last descendant from which the Historical Society bought the furniture was in the area one time. It was probably around 2010, somewhere around there, and happened to stop by the house at the time that one of the volunteers was there. That was Eileen. That she was there, and she saw them in front of the house, and he told her who he was. She went out to greet him, and he told her who he was, and she gave him a tour of the house. And right after that, then right at that time, they said, well, when I pass away, then you're getting the furniture. So just so happened that, and that they, that they made that contact, and it was direct contact.
Thank you, Trish. Trish is a past member of our board of trustees too, so thank you. Yeah?
The house that they lived in Mexico, is it marked or is it still standing there?
Nope, no. Cindy, who's a current member of our board of trustees, had taken a drive up to Mesopotamia about a year ago to really scope that out and try to figure out if we could find where it is. And if I'm remembering this correctly, Cindy, there was like sort of a dirt road and then it kind of trailed off, and it would be in an area that's not inhabited now.
I think it's part of the Western Reserve Conservancy or something.
Okay. Yeah.
But part of Louisa's, and I don't have it straight in my head, part of Louisa's second marriage, one of those descendants was Hines, and I think they were big in Youngstown, Poland. I don't have how the connections went, but one of her great daughters married a Hines.
Okay. Thank you. Anyone else? Janet?
A couple things. There are streets named after all these
Mm-hmm.
And tell us about your new project, the new house.
So, thank you, I'd love to. And Bill touched on this as well. So you can imagine as an organization operating out of an 1807 home can be very tricky in terms of just space constraints and just the ethics of changing that home, right? And the Trumbull County Historical Society this last month finalized a negotiation to purchase an 1894 building on Warren's Mahoning Avenue, Millionaires Row, that we are now launching a campaign to renovate and move into within the next year and a half, fingers crossed. So we'll be moving our offices, we'll be opening up classroom space and an education center there, and making the John Stark Edwards House the truly preserved space that it should be, right? Right now it has the wear and tear of it being an office every day. But hopefully within the next year, we'll be able to move that out and renovate the rooms to one other families and tell other stories of the people that were living there. There's an absolutely wonderful story of the curator who lived in the home. She operated the entire second floor of the house from about 1942 to 1975. So you can imagine 30 years of one woman living there. So having some kind of remodel to showcase her stories and the other people, the other curators and renters that lived there throughout the years, is something that we're just starting to get our feet wet in, starting to plan for. We'll be holding a series of community meetings over the next 6 months or so to get more input in terms of what the community would like to see happen in those spaces. So if that's something that you're interested in, if you'd like to follow, please visit our website, visit our Facebook page. Those community meetings will be completely open to the public, so your input would be valued. Yes?
Walking and trolley tours that's on this flyer, what are those?
Yeah, so this coming year, we're doing a second Saturday walking tour series. It will be up on our website in the next week or so, so give me a few days, and then please check back there. We're highlighting different downtowns throughout Trumbull County. Downtown Mesopotamia is one of those. Downtown North Bloomfield is another, downtown Kinsman, in addition to doing the Millionaire's Row walk in downtown Warren as well. So second Saturday of every month, April through October. Yes?
Can you make arrangements to do it on a Thursday or Friday?
If you have a group larger than 5 or 6 people, that's something we can accommodate, yes.
And you just call this number on the back?
Exactly. Anything? Yes, Tracy. Yeah, thank you. So we do host a lecture series the first Sunday of every month. April through December. This year, it's going to be at different locations throughout the county. And actually, in April is one that you guys just heard a couple of months ago. We're bringing back Marcia Levy to do Historic Homes of Liberty on April 7th. And then the first Sunday of May will be at the Harriet Taylor Upton House in downtown Warren. Richard Dana, who's a women's rights advocate from Ashtabula County, will be speaking on Route 45 and the significance of Route 45 in the Underground Railroad and the suffrage movement. All right. Well, thank you all. It was a pleasure to be here. I'll stick around. If you have any questions, let me know. Have a great day.
Well, that was very informative. Thank you again, Megan, for providing so much good information about the family, the Edwards family, and the home, and bringing some Trumbull County down here to Mahoning County. Please come back Thursday, April 18th for our next installment, which will be about Youngstown and the Titanic. And again, thank you for being here today. And if you would like, and you're not a member, to see the exhibits on the first floor, please check in at the gift shop down in the lobby area about that. So otherwise, have a good rest of your day and hope to see you in April.